Today, we announce the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein. The charges allege that Epstein sexually abused young girls by enticing them to engage in sex acts for money. Epstein was arrested this past Saturday evening at Teterboro Airport aboard his private jet that had just landed from Paris, France. Epstein was taken to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, and later today he will be presented before Magistrate Judge Pittman and later a conference before District Court Judge Berman. The United States Attorney's Office will take the position at that presentment and that conference that Epstein should be detained pending trial. Epstein is charged in a two-count indictment. First, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, and second, the substantive crime of sex trafficking of underage girls. Beginning in at least 2002 and continuing until 2005, Epstein is alleged to have abused dozens of victims by causing them to engage in sex acts with him at his mansion in New York and at his estate in Palm Beach, Florida. The victims, all underage girls at the time of the alleged conduct, were given hundreds of dollars in cash after each encounter, either by Epstein or by one of Epstein's employees. The underage girls were initially recruited to provide Epstein with massages and often did so nude or partially nude. These massages became increasingly sexual in nature and would typically include one or more sex acts as specified in the indictment. As alleged, Epstein also paid certain victims to recruit additional girls to be similarly abused. This allowed Epstein to create an ever-expanding web of new victims. This conduct, as alleged, went on for years, and it involved dozens of young girls, some as young as 14 years old at the time that they were allegedly abused. As alleged, Epstein was well aware that many of his victims were minors, and not surprisingly, many of the underage girls that Epstein allegedly victimized were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. The alleged behavior shocks the conscience, and while the charged conduct is from a number of years ago, it is still profoundly important to the many alleged victims, now young women. They deserve their day in court, and we are proud to be standing up for them by bringing this indictment. Combating sex trafficking and exploitation of children is a priority for this office and for the Department of Justice, as the sexual abuse of a minor can have devastating effects on victims, often lasting for years. That is why my office will not rest until perpetrators of these types of crimes are brought to justice. Victims' voices, including the many voices of Epstein's alleged victims, must be heard. To that end, I want to say to anyone who is watching this or hearing about our prosecution, if you believe you are a victim of this man, Jeffrey Epstein, or you have evidence or information relating to the conduct alleged in the indictment unsealed today, we want to hear from you. Please call 1-800-CALL-FBI. That's 1-800-CALL-FBI.
Preserving the innocence of children is one of the most important responsibilities we carry as adults. Purposely failing children in any way is not an option. And yet there are some in society who have chosen to blatantly disregard this responsibility, using whatever means they have at their disposal to lure children into a life which they should never have been exposed. As we allege today, Jeffrey Epstein is one of those people. At approximately 5:30 p.m. on Saturday evening, we arrested him at Teterboro Airport without incident. Epstein has been charged with one count each of sex trafficking and sex trafficking conspiracy. For at least a 4-year period covering the entirety of 2002 through 2005, he is alleged to have sexually exploited and abused dozens of minor girls at his homes in New York City and in Palm Beach, Florida. The girls were recruited in a variety of ways, usually by employees of Epstein and sometimes by fellow victims. The victims typically received hundreds of dollars in cash. The estimated dozens of victims were as young as 14 years old at time of recruitment. Children who provided Epstein massages while they were nude or partially nude. Children who were asked to engage in direct and indirect sex acts for money. Children who were enticed to do all these things at the hands of a man more than or nearly 3 times their age. Those who have been victimized by child sexual predators are frequently haunted by memories of these crimes well into their adulthood, often for the rest of their lives. They bear the burden of someone else's criminal behavior. Too often, adults in our society have turned a blind eye to this type of criminal behavior alleged here. We have seen the excuses, the ignorance of many who didn't even bother to understand that this behavior is a persistent scourge against our society's vulnerable youth, and the willful blindness as to who the real villains are in this type of outrageous crime. The villains are the adult perpetrators, not the children. Victims of child sex trafficking come from all walks of life. They are our neighbors, our students, young adults looking for help, vulnerable foster children. The list goes on and on and on. To the victims who may be listening or get word of today's charges, the team standing here before you represents FBI special agents, NYPD detectives, analysts, victim specialists, prosecutors, who make it their mission to listen to every individual who's been exploited and to advocate for the most vulnerable among us. We are parents, we are community members, we are human beings. But as an FBI special agent and the head of this office, I have the privilege to represent and stand among many who make it our mission to put predators behind bars where they belong, regardless of the predator's power, wealth, or perceived connections. Today, I'm asking everyone to take a good look at this man. If you have been victimized in any way, or if you are somebody who has any additional information about his alleged illegal behavior, we want to hear from you. Whatever age you are now, whatever age you were then, no matter where or when the incident or incidents took place. The number to call is 1-800-CALL-FBI. I'd like to take a moment to speak directly to the victims who will call that number. When you call that number, you'll receive a series of prompts. You'll be asked if this is representing a major case in the country. The answer is yes, it's number 4. You will then be driven to the top of the list, and the Jeffrey Epstein matter is number 1 on the major case list in the country when you call that 1-800-CALL-FBI number. Your bravery might just empower others to speak out about crimes committed against them. It's important to remember there never was, nor will there be, an excuse for this kind of behavior. We know that reliving these events can be brutal. We are here to work side by side with you as you go through this process. You should know that in the eyes of the FBI, you come first. Many thanks, as always, to our partners from the Southern District. Our partnership with the NYPD on this case and so many others has been phenomenal. Thank you also to the professionals at CBP and to the Port Authority Police Department who helped us with the arrest on Saturday evening. Last but not least, I want to extend my thanks to the NYPD Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force. The public should know that to be on this task force, you must volunteer. The work is agonizing, but it is one of the most noble missions our agencies can engage in, and we engage in it together. Thank you.
Yes, Jeffrey Epstein entered into a non-prosecution agreement with the Southern District of Florida. That agreement only binds, by its terms, only binds the Southern District of Florida. The Southern District of New York is not bound by that agreement and is not a signatory to that agreement.
Looking at the evidence, how confident are you that Jeffrey Epstein is going to spend the next several decades of his life behind bars?
Look, I'm not going to comment right now on the evidence. I will say that we are going to request detention pending the trial in this case.
I was just wondering, reading this indictment, as someone has already asked, what are the activities alleged in this indictment already on the Department of Justice's radar way back in 2008 when Miami's U.S. Attorney General Alexander Ocasio, now Secretary of Labor, brokered a state plea bargain? Why is there no accounting for the very robust participation of DOJ at the time? And is there new information that you have or new evidence?
I'm not going into any dealings with Maine Justice, nor am I going to go into any aspects of how our investigation originated. I will say that we were assisted from some excellent investigative journalism.
For the FBI, for the assistant director, I just wanted to ask you, the FBI tried to get him years ago the first time. How important was it to get back at this, to try and bring charges against him again, given everything that transpired?
I wouldn't comment on getting back at anybody or anything. That's not the way we work. We work with facts. When the facts presented themselves, as Mr. Berman hinted at through investigative journalist work, we moved on it.
Use the expression willful blindness. Is any of that directed at the government or investigators who came this the first time around?
No, I'm talking about society in the whole. We've seen sex trafficking cases all over the place. It's a very busy task force, and my opinion is often in society we ignore it, and we ignore the vulnerable victims.
Yes, contemporaneous with the arrest of Epstein at Teterboro Airport, agents executed a search warrant on his mansion in New York City and recovered and seized, and that was a search pursuant to a valid warrant. Agents seized evidence, including nude photographs of what appeared to be underage girls. We think he's a significant flight risk, and that is why we are seeking detention pending trial. He has enormous wealth. The charges are very serious, and they carry with them a maximum sentence of 45 years in jail, which to someone of Epstein's age is basically a life sentence. So we think he has every incentive to try and flee the jurisdiction. And when you have 2 planes and you live much of the year abroad, we think that's a very real risk.
Is Jeffrey Epstein a billionaire?
No comment.
All these victims are underage. You referred to some of them as particularly vulnerable. Why is that the case? Can you elaborate?
I can't go into the specifics with respect to any particular victim.
In the indictment, there are 3 employees. Why weren't they charged in the indictment? So we know about their role and whether they're cooperating or why no charges against them.
No comment.
This is obviously a massive investigation. How do you compare this to other sex trafficking cases you've prosecuted in the past?
Well, it's extremely significant because of the number of years and the number of victims. There are dozens of victims as alleged in the indictment in New York and dozens in Florida, and it maintained itself over several years. So this is very significant. Our office has handled this year, in fact, many significant sex trafficking cases, and this is one of them.
Where do you find these women, and how is he luring them to his mansion or his house?
Well, as alleged in the indictment, these individuals, the underage girls, were sometimes recruited by current victims, and the current victims were given cash payments if they could bring other underage girls to be similarly abused, and that's how he continued to expand the number of new victims that he had, and that's how it was able to maintain itself over several years. The indictment indicates that there were phone calls and contacts made not only with Mr. Epstein, but his employees, between his employees and the alleged victims. Yes.
The record from the defamation case against the associate that is now going to be unsealed in the next couple of weeks, also through the federal court.
No comment.
Yeah, I get this not being your best, but why is the case coming back now? If the charges all happened between 2002 and 2005?
Well, it's still a very important case, and it means a great deal to the alleged victims here that they have their day in court, and we want to ensure that they have their day in court by bringing these charges. Yes.
You had mentioned that there was reporting that, was it the Miami Herald article that might have helped bring forward new victims that you weren't previously aware of?
We are certainly aware of that reporting. Thank you.